What if your entire life you were told you didn't belong? And what if, one day, you had the power to change everything? The cold walls of the courtroom echoed with silence, only broken by the occasional shuffle of papers or the murmur of lawyers. The air was thick with anticipation, but the space felt empty, devoid of warmth or empathy. It was a place where life-changing decisions were made, yet rarely did those decisions bring about any true change. The seats were filled with lawyers, social workers, and a judge whose gaze was as cold as the room. And in the center of it all, sitting by himself, was Malik. He was only 10 years old, but he had lived a lifetime of disappointments. His clothes, second-hand and faded, barely fit his growing frame, and his shoes were worn and scuffed. The scuffs weren't just on his shoes. They were on his soul, too, marks of rejection, of being passed over time and time again. Despite his outward composure, his eyes were filled with a sorrow far beyond his years. They spoke of battles fought that no child should ever have to face. Malik had been moved from home to home for as long as he could remember. The system had failed him at every turn. He wasn't a child that belonged to a loving family. He was a statistic, another foster child waiting for someone, anyone, to choose him. But he knew better than to expect much. He had been in this courtroom too many times to believe that this time would be different. Too many times a hopeful family would sit across from him, smile at him for a while, and then decide he wasn't the right fit. Too many times he had been left with nothing but the empty seat beside him, a promise of tomorrow that never came. He had learned the painful truth that hope was a dangerous thing for a child like him. It hurt too much to keep wishing for something he would never get. He had stopped believing that anyone would ever want him. Malik's fingers fidgeted with the frayed edge of his sleeve as he looked around the room. He watched the social worker beside him flipping through a file, the judge glancing down at his paperwork, and the other families, all of them so different from him. They looked like they had it all figured out, well-dressed, polished, their lives perfect and ready to add another child to their neatly ordered homes. He couldn't help but feel invisible, as if he wasn't even meant to be here. Today was supposed to be another ordinary day, another family, another rejection. He had been told countless times that this was his last chance, but those words didn't carry any weight anymore. After so many failed attempts, how could this time be any different? He glanced up at the clock. Time seemed to slow in this place, as though the minutes were stretched thin by the weight of the decisions that were being made. He had no idea what would happen next, but he was so tired of waiting for the same outcome. He closed his eyes for a moment, blocking out the noise of the room, allowing himself a brief escape from the suffocating reality. He heard his name called, and his heart skipped a beat. The social worker motioned for him to stand, and slowly, with a sense of dread creeping in, he made his way to the front. It was time. The judge's voice was distant, but the words hit him hard. "We're ready to move forward with this case," the judge announced. Malik tried to hold his breath, trying to steel himself for the usual disappointment. But today, something felt different. He couldn't quite explain it. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a chance. He stood there, his knees shaking slightly, waiting for the inevitable to unfold. But as the judge looked at the documents, and as the social worker spoke with quiet certainty, Malik realized that maybe, just maybe, today would be different. What he didn't know, as he stood there in front of the court, was that his story was about to take an unexpected turn, Where are you watching from? And what time is it? Drop a comment below. The courtroom was silent. All eyes were on him as Malik stood up, his small frame trembling slightly but with determination. The judge, a woman who had heard countless cases like his, paused mid-sentence, as if she hadn't quite processed what had just happened. "You're my mom," Malik repeated, louder this time, his voice cracking with the weight of the words he had never thought he would say. Judge Carter blinked, looking up at him from behind her glasses. The room, which had been buzzing with the quiet hum of whispered conversations, seemed to pause as everyone tried to make sense of what had just occurred. Malik's heart raced, his palms sweaty. He had never imagined speaking those words aloud, let alone in front of all these people who had seen him as nothing but a problem for most of his life. But he was done being invisible, done sitting quietly in the background, waiting for someone to see him. If they weren't going to notice him, he would make them. "I said, you're my mom," he repeated, his voice shaky but resolute. "You can't just keep saying that nobody wants me. I want you to be my mom." A silence followed, thick and heavy, as Judge Carter's gaze softened. She seemed to process the words, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Malik stood there, his chest heaving as he tried to keep his composure, but every muscle in his body screamed to run. Still, he didn't move. His eyes were locked on the judge, and for the first time he felt seen. The judge put down the file, her hands steady as she folded them in front of her. "Malik," she began, her voice softer than before, "I'm afraid it's not that simple." But Malek wasn't about to back down. Not now, not after everything. Why not? "You're right there in the file, Judge. You've seen me. You know who I am. Why won't you just pick me?" He couldn't hide the frustration that slipped into his words, the anger at being rejected again, at being labeled difficult, too old, too much of a problem. He had spent years in the system, moving from one foster home to the next, never staying long enough to feel like he belonged. They all had a reason to turn him away. He wasn't cute enough, he was too much work, his skin was too dark. The people in charge of his future saw nothing but what they didn't want. Judge Carter's face softened, but her gaze remained fixed on the papers in front of her. She didn't meet his eyes, and that made it worse. "I don't want to be invisible anymore," Malik whispered to himself, but loud enough for the room to hear. He stood his ground, staring at the judge, waiting for her to give him the answer he had been waiting for. Waiting for the moment when he would be seen, when someone would finally choose him. But there was nothing but silence. The weight of the courtroom's judgment pressed down on him, and for a moment, his confidence faltered. He was just a boy in an adult world that didn't care for him. It would have been so easy to retreat, to slink back into the shadows where he had spent most of his life, to disappear like he always had. But he couldn't. Not today. Not when he was so close. "Malik," the judge finally spoke, her voice low and full of regret. "I know how hard this is for you. But we have to consider what's best for you, not just what you want." Malik clenched his fists, trying to hold back the sting of rejection, but he refused to let the tears fall. "I don't care about what's best for me. I care about someone seeing me. Just once. Just for who I am. I'm not a problem. I'm not mistaken. I'm not invisible." He turned away from the judge, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, and in that moment, he felt both exposed and powerful. "You're my mom. I don't want to be alone anymore. I just want someone to love me. What would you have done in his place?" Let us know in the comments. The judge's eyes widened, her gavel still poised above the bench, caught in the motion as though the entire moment had left her frozen. She stared at Malik, her face unreadable. But the sudden shift in her expression was enough to stop anyone in the room from breathing. For the first time, the official, unyielding figure of the court had faltered. In the presence of a child's raw vulnerability, even the authority of the law seemed to tremble. There were gasps from the audience, murmurs rippling through the room like a wave breaking on the shore. A child, a foster child, was asking for what he had been denied for most of his life. He was asking for love, for connection, for the most basic thing any child should be entitled to. The judge's eyes softened, and she blinked rapidly, trying to clear the unexpected sting in her eyes. The shift from a cold, clinical courtroom to something more human was palpable. Malik took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His hands clenched at his sides, fingers trembling. He had made himself vulnerable in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be before. The words were out now, and the weight of them was all-consuming. He'd put everything on the line, exposed the raw truth of his heart to people who had only ever seen him as a case number, an application, a statistic. "I just want someone to love me," he repeated softly, voice breaking at the end. It wasn't a demand, but a plea, a simple request. His eyes stayed fixed on Judge Carter's face. For the first time, he allowed himself to look at her and hope. Judge Carter's expression softened. Her hand fell from the gavel, the movement slow as she placed it on the desk in front of her. Her gaze drifted down to the case file in front of her, the paper now a blur in her hands. But her thoughts were elsewhere, consumed by the boy standing in front of her, waiting for something. The courtroom was still, all eyes on her as the judge silently wrestled with what had just transpired. This wasn't a case of legalities. This wasn't an issue to be solved with paperwork. This was a moment of humanity. Tears welled up in the corners of Judge Carter's eyes. She quickly wiped them away, but not before Malik saw. He saw the unspoken recognition in her eyes, the realization that what he had just asked for, what he was demanding, wasn't too much. That every child deserved to be loved. For a brief second, the walls of the courtroom seemed to fade. It was just Malik, just a child, standing in front of the person who had the power to decide his future. For a moment, it was no longer about the law, no longer about case files or checklists. It was about a boy who had been forgotten by so many, now standing up and saying he wouldn't be forgotten anymore. And that moment would change everything. The judge took a deep breath, her voice low but steady. "Malik," she said, his name heavy in the air, "you are not invisible. You have always deserved a family. But before she could finish, the audience stirred. Murmurs filled the room again, but this time they weren't about pity or uncertainty. They were whispers of awe. They were people starting to realize the weight of the moment, the gravity of what Malik had just done. He had stepped into the light, taken ownership of his future, and made himself seen in a world that had largely turned its back on him. Judge Carter sat at her desk, the silence in the room heavy as she stared at the file in front of her. It was a file she had seen 100 times before, case after case of children in the system, each one a statistic, each one just another file to be processed. But Malik's file was different. His words, "You're my mom," echoed in her mind, and for the first time in her career, she didn't know how to respond. She had ruled on thousands of cases. She had been cold, efficient, detached. It was her job to make hard decisions. decisions that shaped the futures of children she would never meet, children who would either be sent to families or back into the system. But this was different. Malik wasn't just another child in the system. He wasn't a case number. He wasn't a list of problems and potential. He was a person, a child, a boy who had been ignored, who had been passed from home to home, who had learned to be invisible just to survive. And now he had done the unthinkable. He had asked her, a complete stranger, to be his mother. His voice was quiet, but so full of emotion. His words, though simple, carried the weight of years of disappointment, rejection, and a desperate need for love. Her gaze drifted down to the case file. She read the words over and over. Multiple failed placements. Gifted but misunderstood. Too strong for his own good. Too broken to believe in hope anymore. Judge Carter felt a pang of guilt stab through her chest. How many children like Malik had passed through this courtroom? How many had been treated as nothing more than paperwork? How many had been sent back into the system, back into homes where they were seen as burdens or problems, never given the chance to be seen as what they truly were? Children in need of love and support. She glanced down at Malik's face, still fresh in her mind. The fear and the courage that had been mixed in his eyes when he spoke those words. "You're my mom." The boy, who had been failed by every system meant to protect him, was standing there, hoping that she would see him, truly see him. Her hands shook slightly as she closed the file. She had never felt this kind of guilt before. She had never questioned her decisions. She had never been faced with a child who needed her to do something more than just follow the rules. This wasn't about a case anymore. This wasn't about a decision to be made based on paperwork, on facts, on a system that had been designed to protect the good ones while discarding the others. This was about a boy who had been given up on by everyone but himself, who had dared to ask for a chance, to ask for someone to care about him. She had always been impartial. She had always been the judge, the one who decided who deserved what. But Malik's words had shaken her to her core. She wasn't just a judge anymore. She was a person. And for the first time, she had to make a decision that wasn't based on the law. It was based on what was right. What would she do? She had the power. She had the authority. She could send him back into the system to the same heartache he had endured his entire life. Or she could make a choice that would change everything. The courtroom was quiet, and for a long moment she sat there, her mind racing. She had always prided herself on being objective, on making decisions based on the law, on the rules. But she couldn't ignore the humanity in front of her anymore. "Malik," she said again, with a firmness that filled the room, "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you find the family you deserve. You are not alone." For the first time in years, Malik's eyes widened with hope. The weight he had been carrying for so long seemed to lift from his shoulders, if only for a moment. And in that moment, Judge Carter realized that sometimes justice wasn't about what the law said. It was about doing what was right, what was needed, and what would change a life. The room was still, the air thick with anticipation. The eyes of every person in the courtroom were fixed on Judge Carter, waiting for what would happen next. This was a moment that would change everything, not just for Malik, but for the very system that had failed him for so long. Judge Carter stepped down from the bench. Her black robe swept across the floor, each step purposeful. She made her way over to Malik, her movements slow, deliberate, as if each step was measured with the weight of a decision she had never been prepared to make. The silence in the room grew heavier with each passing second. People looked at each other, unsure of what to expect. Was this just another day in the courtroom, another child whose fate would be decided with a cold, detached verdict? Or was something different happening here? Malek, still sitting in that chair, felt his heart racing. This wasn't how he had imagined this moment going. All he had ever wanted was someone to see him, to truly see him. He had given up hope years ago that anyone would ever claim him. But now, here was Judge Carter, walking toward him, her face softening as she approached. When she knelt in front of him, eye to eye, the room seemed to fade away. It was just him and her. And in that moment, Malik realized something had shifted. Something was happening that was beyond anything he had ever dreamed. "You're right," Judge Carter said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I am your mom." The words hit Malik like a wave. His chest tightened, his throat burned, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. Her words were enough. In that moment, he felt a sense of warmth and belonging that he had never known. All the years of rejection, of being told he wasn't enough, of being passed over and ignored. Suddenly, they didn't matter. Because now, someone had chosen him. Someone saw him. "And I'm so sorry it took me this long to see you," Judge Carter continued, her voice breaking slightly. Malik's eyes welled up. The tears came without warning, slipping down his face. He had spent his entire life waiting for someone to claim him, to tell him that he mattered, to say that he was worth loving. And now, in front of everyone, someone finally had. Judge Carter, the woman who had always been a figure of authority, a distant judge who ruled with logic and reason, had just given him something he didn't know was even possible. A mother. She reached out, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. Malik looked up, his heart racing, his breath shallow. The words he had longed to hear echoed in his mind. "I am your mom." It wasn't just a promise. It was a declaration, a commitment that he hadn't even dared to dream about. The courtroom, still silent, felt like a world away. For Malik, there was nothing but Judge Carter, nothing but the woman who had made a choice that would change his life forever. He had never imagined that someone like her would choose him. Someone so powerful, so important, someone whose life had been so far removed from his own. Yet here she was, kneeling in front of him, offering him something he had never had. A chance, a family. He swallowed hard, his chest tight with emotion, unable to find the words to thank her. But he didn't need to speak. His tears said everything. For Judge Carter, this moment was the culmination of a realization she had never expected. She had spent her career making decisions based on law, based on rules. But now, standing in front of this boy, she understood that law wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to simply follow the rules. The true measure of justice wasn't found in the pages of a legal code. It was found in the willingness to see the humanity in everyone, to offer compassion, and to recognize that sometimes the right decision wasn't the easiest one. In the silence that followed, she stood up, taking Malik's hand in hers. It wasn't just a gesture. It was a promise. The promise of a future together, a promise that Malik would never again have to fight for his place in the world. "Let's go home," she said quietly. And in that moment, Malik knew that everything had changed. The world that had once been a place of rejection and pain had suddenly become a place of possibility. He had a family. He had a future. And for the first time, he felt like he truly belonged. Would you have taken that leap of faith? Tell us in the comments. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of the moment heavy in the air. For the first time in his life, Malik felt truly seen. The cold, impersonal room that had been the backdrop for so many of his disappointments was now a place of transformation. Judge Carter, the woman who had spent her career making decisions that affected lives, was about to make the most important one of her own. The gavel slammed down, the sound sharp and definitive. It echoed through the room, signaling the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Judge Carter signed the papers herself, her handwriting steady and sure, as if sealing a promise, not just a legal agreement. The court had ruled. Malik was hers. Gasps rippled through the room. Some in the audience were stunned, others wiping tears from their eyes, moved by the unexpected turn of events. The world had watched as Malik, a child overlooked and dismissed, had fought for his right to be seen, and now, in this very courtroom, he had won something far more precious than any legal victory. Applause broke out, soft at first, but growing stronger. The sound was a celebration not just of a legal decision, but of something far more profound: love, acceptance, and the courage to choose what was right, even when it seemed impossible. The murmurs of disbelief and surprise turned into a chorus of support. For Malik, it was a moment of overwhelming relief. All the years of being passed over, ignored, and rejected were suddenly replaced by a sense of belonging, a sense of being wanted. For the first time, he didn't have to fight for space in this world. He had a place, a family. Judge Carter, now his mother, stood and walked over to him. Her gaze softened, her heart full as she looked at the child she had just claimed as her own. She held out her hand, and Malik took it, their fingers intertwined in a bond that had only just been forged, but already felt stronger than anything he had ever known. "Come on, son, let's go home," she said, her voice a mix of warmth and determination. She knew this wasn't just about legal adoption. This was about a promise she had made, to him, to herself, and to the world, that love would be what guided her decisions. Malik smiled, a real smile. Not the kind he had given before, the one born from necessity, or a mask of resilience. No, this smile was different. It was the kind of smile that said, "I finally belong." It was the kind of smile that said he no longer had to hide or pretend. He was loved. He was wanted. He had a home. The world that had once looked at him with indifference now looked at him with a new understanding. And for the first time, Malik could see the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by survival, but by choice. He didn't have to settle for the scraps anymore. He could dream. He could be more. As they walked out of the courtroom together, Malik's heart felt lighter than it ever had before. He had found his family, not in the places he had expected, but in the person who had chosen him. And for the first time he knew that love didn't follow the rules. It didn't wait for permission. It simply chose. And now it had chosen him. Where are you watching from? And what time is it? Drop a comment below.